From South Carolina Public Radio, this is Walter Edgar's Journal. I'm Walter Edgar, welcoming you to our podcast about South Carolina culture and history with a nod to all things Southern. This week, we'll be talking with Jennifer Whitmer Taylor about her book, Rebirth, Creating the Museum of the Reconstruction Era and the Future of the House Museum.
Dr. Taylor is an associate professor of public history at Duquesne University who specializes in public history. And in her book, she uses the Museum of the Reconstruction Era as a case study, offering best practices for interpreting issues of contested public memory for 21st century audiences.
Taylor challenges readers to contemplate how historic sites interact with and contribute to vital contemporary political conversations. Jennifer, welcome to the Journal. We're going to talk about what is a local topic, but it's not really a local topic. But first of all, how did you end up writing about this house museum in Columbia, South Carolina?
Well, thank you for having me. I am an associate professor of public history at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I am a public historian by training. I went to the University of South Carolina, and I work primarily with museums, oral history, and digital history. So I'm what they call a practitioner. So I study history in the traditional ways that all historians are trained, but I also present a lot of the history to the public, as that's what a public historian does. So that's how I became involved with what was once called the Woodrow Wilson Family Home. I moved to Columbia, South Carolina in 2011 to begin my PhD, and I immediately started working for Historic Columbia, which is the preservation organization in Columbia, South Carolina, but they also maintain 4 historic house museums, and I would deliver tours as a docent part-time on the weekends to sort of supplement my PhD education, and became very active with Historic Columbia. And as I was moving through my PhD program, I knew I wanted to combine something public history with my passion. Originally was for civil rights in the 20th century. I grew up in Kentucky, had a lot of questions about sort of the segregated world, which I still lived in the 1990s. And that sort of set me on a path to civil rights, which once you know the second Reconstruction, the civil rights movement, you begin to open up study of Reconstruction, I think a lesser known period. So when I was at Historic Columbia, they were rehabilitating the Woodrow Wilson Family Home, now the Museum of the Reconstruction Era. There was about a 9-year closure. And when they reopened, they opened as a Museum of Reconstruction. And I ended up playing a vital role there, helping them develop the script, conducting the vast majority of tours in the first year of its opening, training the docents, and then processing visitor evaluation. So I spent about a year and a half in that role as tour facilitator at Historic Columbia, and then completed the dissertation on that subject and spent the next 8 years revising that dissertation into the book.
Well, two terms. You've already defined public history beautifully, by the way. Thank you for doing that. But the Historic House Museum, it's something that is kind of, particularly in the South, they're everywhere. But it's a national phenomenon. You can have historic house museums in Denver, Colorado. I've been there. So let's talk about what they are and eventually what is their future.
Oh, that's a great question. So this was a movement that really began with Mount Vernon, essentially, and actually a South Carolina native, Anne Pamela Cunningham. And before the Civil War, she was active getting women involved in saving George Washington's plantation, essentially. And so a lot of the early historic house museums, particularly in the 19th century, tended to be related to George Washington. They saved a lot of those sites. And then you begin to see this expand, particularly for elite homes and national figures. So Monticello and Thomas Jefferson would be a good example. Sometimes people call that Mount Vernon 2.0. So it was really an effort in the 19th and early 20th centuries to save the homes of elite white men, essentially, and open them to the public and have people come in and learn about our founding. You know, in the context of Mount Vernon, it was saved sort of as an effort to mend the sectionalism that was brewing in the 1850s. leading up to the Civil War. And hopefully this could be a way to reunite sort of North and South over this issue of slavery that was threatening to rip the country apart. And we continue to see this model of what we call shrine house museums really into the mid-20th century. And so the Woodrow Wilson Family Home in Columbia was one of those sites. It's preserved specifically by the American Legion Auxiliary, the women's wing of the American Legion. And they saved it after Wilson's death and presidency as a shrine to him and to World War I. So these historic house museums have been enduring for a century and a half, but there are far too many of them today, and they're hard to maintain, mostly because of fiscal issues, low visitation. It's hard to maintain a full-time staff. For example, at some of these sites, a lot of them are run by maybe one executive director or a handful of volunteers. So they can't all survive, and that's the moment we're at now in the 21st century. Which ones do you save? Why do you save them? And if you're going to try to save the historic house museum in your community, what value does it have in the 21st century, and how might you reimagine it for new audiences and bring new people into public history, into the historic house museum movement?
Well, 50 years ago, working with Historic Columbia and teaching historic preservation, each one of these homes, wherever they are, they all said, we're going to be, well, we can't be the next Mount Vernon, but we're going to be the next Monticello. Everybody's going to be the path to come to, whether it's the Robert Mills House, which never really was much of a home in terms of a family. You can go anywhere, these homes, and they frequently kind of morphed in from being a person's home to what we used to refer to as the All Hail to Chippendale, the Historic House Museum as a beautiful place.
Sure.
And Robert Mills could have been Exhibit A on that.
And that's, I think, a challenge historic house museums have, because older audiences expect that, right? They want to come into a house museum and hear about the elite, talk about the furniture that may or may not be original to the home, unique architecture. In the case of Robert Mills, right? It's designed by Robert Mills, the famed architect. And as you said, it was not a home that people lived in very long. It becomes a seminary, it becomes a women's college, but the unique architectural features are right what people expect to see when they come in.
Well, and this is a side story because it's beyond the Woodrow Wilson House, but Historic Columbia has also reinterpreted the Robert Mills House and the Hampton Preston House.
Yes, and I think the Woodrow Wilson Family Home, or now the Museum of the Reconstruction Era, actually, I think, set the stage for those reinterpretations. When I was at Historic Columbia, I also helped with an early reinterpretation of the Man Simons site, which is the fourth house museum we have not mentioned yet that Historic Columbia administers. And it was a site to a middle-class Black family in prior to the Civil War and Jim Crow, which is a remarkable story in and of itself. And, they're building a vibrant business on their property. And so telling that story was important to Historic Columbia. And I think reimagining that space. And they did a bigger remodel later, but that sort of set the stage. And then here comes the Woodrow Wilson Family Home and this unique interpretation of Reconstruction, using the house itself as the primary artifact, right? The house was here in Reconstruction, and that's when Woodrow Wilson lived here. So let's talk about that time period and the space of Columbia during that era. But after that, as you said, I think they've turned essentially and I have not seen the new tour, I've been gone for about 8 years, but I did look at some of the early scripts, and they implemented essentially what is a house museum of slavery to talk about urban slavery in Columbia, which is a really important subject that a lot of house museums don't cover.
Well, they also cover the period when in the second floor, when the Hampton Preston House was also the Chicora Women's College.
Yes.
So, they cover the different uses of the house over time. So,
and I think that's important to Historic Columbia, because I think primarily they are a preservation organization. So they really want to show you change over time in these houses. And I think they worked to connect all of these houses. We opened the tour at the Museum of the Reconstruction Era, asking you to imagine Tommy Woodrow Wilson. And I'm going to call him Tommy during this interview because that's what his parents called him in this house. It does shock people a little bit to hear the president referred to that way. But, imagine literally walking in his footsteps from his house a block away from Robert Mills' home, which was the seminary at the time for the Presbyterian Church. And that's where his father worked. So immersing yourself in his neighborhood.
Well, I think that's what some people look at Woodrow Wilson. They know he was born in Staunton, Virginia, Augusta, Georgia. His father was a pastor there, but then his father became associated with the Columbia Theological Seminary, Presbyterian Seminary, and they moved to Columbia. And the Woodrow Wilson Family Home actually was the first house that they physically owned. Is that not correct?
That is correct. In fact, that's one of the points we like to make with people that came in the home, that sort of aspirational dream of the middle class in the United States, right? Imagine buying your first home, or when you bought your first home, if you were able to do that or wanting to do that, right? That was a dream the Wilson family had as well.
Tommy Wilson, and I'm sorry, some of the docents used to laugh. Woodrow Wilson always comes across as a little bit on the pompous side. How could he have been called Tommy, bless his heart? But he spent his teenage years here in Columbia, and he was witness to Reconstruction, which was going on 3 blocks away at the state capitol.
Yes, and the proximity of his home, I think, to seats of power is a remarkable part of the story as well, and something I spent some time talking about in the book. But yes, he's a product of the Presbyterian world, I think, first and foremost. His father, yes, is a pastor, but I think an intellectual. So is his uncle, who, loved, for example, the origin of species, sort of this hot topic of the day in the late 19th century. So he's immersed in a very literate, deeply thinking world. And I think that framed a lot of his experience. But as you said, he is also a teenager at the moment where he is developing a deeply profound interest in government. We might call him an Anglophile. He was definitely interested in what was happening in Great Britain and English politics. And so it's hard for me to imagine, as a historian, him thinking about other nation states and how they lead, and not thinking a little bit about what a biracial government is emerging in Columbia as he's a teenager.
Well, a couple of things. We mentioned the state capitol, but the Hampton Preston House, then the old Hampton family home, had been bought by Republican Governor Franklin J. Moses. And that was the center of, for 2 or 3 years, not just politics, but Reconstruction society in Columbia. That was, literally walking distance from where he grew up. But we don't think of the teenage Tommy Wilson as being very athletic. But he was, and he liked baseball.
Yes, he did.
And guess who introduced baseball? It was the Yankee Soldiers.
Yes, and that's something he develops in Augusta, and he, I think he brings that passion with him to Columbia. There are some memoirs that talk a little bit about him being a first-rate baseball player, and some of the memories younger kids had of him at the time that he was a little bit older as a teenager. But one of the sort of famous stories that emerges out of the Augusta House Museum in his early history is that he wrote the bylaws, like essentially a constitution for the baseball team that he played on in Augusta. So, like I said, you can already see that early interest in government and organization. Wilson is a deep thinker, but also a lover of baseball. And I think this is one of the missed opportunities as well that perhaps the Augusta House Museum had an opportunity to talk about and didn't settle into as much. They now, granted, this has been, a decade or so since I've been to that House Museum, but they tended to emphasize the Civil War memories of Wilson. And one of the things that I thought was powerful, particularly reading the executive director there, Eric Montgomery's book on Woodrow Wilson. I learned quite a bit from it. It was a well-researched book. But he learns a lot in Reconstruction during Augusta before he even moves to Columbia. He is enjoying the railroads and the reemergence of industry. He is taking these tours of factories and things with his father as part of that Presbyterian education within his family. He is enjoying baseball. And yeah, he is seeing the effects of the Union presence in the early years following the Civil War. And so I think this notion that a lot of people had for, a century or so was that Reconstruction was just this abysmal sort of, moment that ruined white Southerners or white South Carolinians' lives. And when I look at Woodrow Wilson and his family, I see a child engaged in Reconstruction, enjoying the world in which he lives, and his father at the height of his career. So it doesn't necessarily fit that narrative I think we have of people coming of age in Reconstruction or adults trying to resume their lives after the Civil War.
I have to say, when I was growing up and going to school in Columbia in the 1960s and early 70s, I found the teaching of history of Reconstruction in South Carolina to be, let's just say, wanting.
Well,
Sure.
it's Alfred. It was what's called the Dunning School of history, which painted a dark. It began in the early 20th century, painted a very dark picture of Reconstruction. Nothing good happened. Everything was corrupt.
Right.
It was unique.
Carpetbaggers, scallywags. You're right.
Yes.
And I suspect, Alfred, you were using Mary Sims Oliphant's book, which I talk about quite a bit
Could
in
well
my
have
book
been,
as well.
yeah, because I was in
Which
Richland
was
1 or
the
Richland 2.
standard text from 1935 to 1985 when it was finally replaced.
Okay, yeah.
Well, let's get back to Tommy. He was in Columbia exactly how many years?
So the house, I believe, was completed in 71. It's the tail end of Reconstruction. They're really gone before the campaign of the Red Shirts and Wade Hampton in 1876. The family would have been in Wilmington, North Carolina at that point. So it is a very short period for him. In fact, he lives in Augusta longer than he does Columbia.
Okay, but these were his teenage years before he went off.
Absolutely. He was 14. He was 14, and he sat for a portrait at a local photography studio. So we have an image of him during this time in Columbia. So yeah, transitioning into a young man, getting a private education, probably thinking about what his career is going to be. It could have been very easy for him to become a lawyer or to become a pastor like his father. And so he's kind of got to make some intellectual choices about the path he wants to take, I think, in the New South.
Well, he started off going to college at Davidson, but then he didn't make it, so he moved up to Princeton.
Yeah, and it seems to be he came back home for a little bit. We might call it a gap year today, but he does return to Wilmington very, very briefly, as he's trying to kind of figure out what he's going to do.
But he couldn't make it at Davidson, so he went up to okay, yeah.
That's the story.
But I think that's an interesting point that he, one of the things I found talking to the docents and training them is, and some people were Southerners by birth, some, had grown up in South Carolina, but there was a general understanding that Woodrow Wilson, for lack of a better term, was a Yankee, right? It's a New Jersey governor. He's at Princeton. But his formative years are in the South. And even some of his older biographers would definitely say he was a Southerner by birth. And I think that's kind of been lost in our narratives of Woodrow Wilson.
Well, Columbians of that generation, and certainly later he runs for president, but he's our boy.
Yes.
He's our boy. And powerful people like the Gonzales, who ran the state newspaper, very early on jumped on the Wilson bandwagon. So he's got relatives buried at the First Presbyterian Church here, and he came to Columbia later on as president to visit his Woodrow relatives. I think you make a pretty good case that he did consider himself a Southerner, despite the fact that his adult life was really all spent in the North.
And he says, the South is the only place where, nothing has to be explained to me, right? He feels like himself. And he even said in 1911, before the campaign, he came back to Augusta and he saw Ty Cobb as an actor in a play. And he's talking to the press and he says something to the effect, I just want to kind of be alone with my childhood memories tonight. So, yeah. Well,
let's talk about how the Woodrow Wilson Boyhood Home, you mentioned that the American Legion Auxiliary saved it. And I think that story is an important story as well in terms of the American preservation movement.
It's a unique women's organization, I think, within the larger House Museum movement. We tend to think of groups like the Daughters of the American Revolution or the United Daughters of the Confederacy, which did a lot of preservation work around the same time. So it's kind of it was a group I'd never read about in the Preservation House Museum movement. And so I thought that was remarkable. And I don't think this story has been told until the book. But one of the things I didn't even realize when I was giving tours initially when the house reopened was the sort of unknown battle between the auxiliary and Edith Galt, the widow of Woodrow Wilson, who clearly had plans in mind of how to preserve her husband's memory, and they did not include Columbia. And so I don't think they knew it in the moment, but they're kind of working against what is now the Presidential Library in Stanton, Virginia, his birthplace, because that's where Edith Galt put her energy.
Well, as the docents used to say, they can talk all they want to in Stanton, but we got the bed where he was birthed.
Oh, the bed. That was simultaneously, a blessing and a curse in the reinterpretation. And it really does belong in Stanton, if I'm being honest. Like, I understand the impulse to keep it. It's the bed he's born in, but I feel like it belongs in Stanton. And I think what's probably a little bit painful for Stanton is that he's really only there for 2 years. I have a toddler that's 3. He doesn't remember anything about Stanton, Virginia. And that's what's so interesting about him using it to claim his Virginian roots, to put him in line with, the founding fathers with ties to Virginia. So he and Edith leaned into those Virginia roots in a way that maybe is not accurate to what he remembers about his childhood.
Well, his daddy didn't come from Virginia.
No, his parents were both from the North. And I would argue converted very much to becoming Southerners. And I think it's pretty clear his father was a Confederate supporter as well. So they didn't necessarily bring all of those Northern sensibilities about abolition and things like that with them when they moved south.
All right. I'd like to go back to the Woodrow Wilson house before, first of all, was put into mothballs. It had to be, a lot of work had to be done on it. But you only have a handful of pieces of furniture that actually belonged to the Wilson family. And it was interpreted, except for the place that they had his office, sort of. This is what a middle-class family in Columbia, how they lived in the 1870s. So the transformation from the Woodrow Wilson boyhood home to the Museum of the Reconstruction Era in the Woodrow Wilson Family Home is not quite as drastic as some people would like to say. It was already being interpreted in general as this is what white middle-class Columbians, how they lived, and actually a lot better than most white middle-class Columbians lived.
Yes, and having been to both homes, the Augusta and and working in the Columbia House, you can see they liked the Augusta manse that the Presbyterian Church provided for them that they lived in Augusta, because they replicate a lot of its features in the home that they owned. So clearly they picked up some things from these Presbyterian homes being provided by the church as they moved across the South. But most of the items that the home has that are connected to the Wilson family were procured by the auxiliary. In one case, there's the dresser, and another piece that his, I believe, great niece donated when she returned from missionary work with her family. I believe they were in Japan and just needed some income, I suspect, to set up their middle class home, and had allowed the auxiliary to purchase those items to put in there. So a lot of the items they've had since the very beginning. And I think that was a common misconception too, that the Moore, as we call it, the Museum of the Reconstruction Era, did not have, they were late to the preservation game for Woodrow Wilson, so they didn't get as many pieces. And that's actually not true. They're forming the same time as Stanton. They're getting a handful of pieces, but Edith is feeding pieces from their home in Washington, D.C., and other reproduction items that would have conveyed this middle-class family as well into Stanton. So what they end up doing is filling the Moore or the Woodrow Wilson Family Home with, a lot of reproduction pieces or authentic pieces from the period, but none of which have any connection to Woodrow Wilson or his family.
Okay, so we really don't have the basis for doing the Historic House Museum. How is Historic Columbia telling the story today?
Essentially, there's a dual narrative there. It is Woodrow Wilson as the lens, but it is very much a museum about Reconstruction. And when it opened, and still to this day, I have not seen any evidence that suggests that it is not the first museum solely devoted to Reconstruction in the country. And so that was intentional, right? They wanted to tell the story of Reconstruction, but it is also 2009, 2010, up to 2014, where there is still, I think, concern in the state and in Columbia about just making it a Reconstruction museum. And Woodrow Wilson is, of course, the important figure affiliated with the home. So they begin to develop this dual narrative. And so the goal in the house was to present various themes of Reconstruction through the lens of the Wilson family, and then also everyday people in Reconstruction, particularly the Black community that have largely been ignored. So, for example, you come in and meet the family, you get some definitions about Reconstruction, and then you move into the first parlor, which normally would have been outfitted with, lounges and sofas, and you would come in and this is where the family would take you, and that you might wait for them to come, and if they were busy you'd leave your calling card. This is sort of the traditional narrative you would see in that former parlor space in any historic house museum in the country that's doing a traditional tour. And instead they introduce local and state politics. You begin to see the formation of a biracial state government, like as you said, just 3 miles away at the state capitol.
Okay, now,
and then you also were introduced to Reconstruction Era Columbia through an interactive map that places you there.
Okay, Jennifer, how did they do this? Is the docent speaking, or are they using modern technology?
That's a great question. It's actually a combination of both. Because there are because there are only 5 objects original to the family, this becomes an exhibit that relied on panels to provide a lot of information, as well as several well-placed items connected to the family to really connect you to them. And so the docent is doing what we called a semi-guided tour. There was a feeling that given the violence of the era that has to be discussed, that it is such a little known subject for most people not in the history field, and particularly South Carolinians, that grew up with what Bruce Baker would call a white supremacist memory of Reconstruction. They don't know anything really. What they, the first question we would ask on the front porch was, when I say the word Reconstruction, what does that bring to mind? And the vast majority of people would say carpetbagger. That was the first thing that they remember.
Okay,
right?
But that's not just South Carolinians.
Oh, no, you're right. Absolutely.
And
what you see are the Southerners kind of tend to, and this is changing over time, of course, but tend to have the negative interpretation of Reconstruction, what they've been taught or learned on the public square in their years in their community. And then you have Northerners that would come and they just simply don't know really anything about it because it's not covered well in their own schools. So it's not so much of a misinterpretation. It's just not something they're really introduced to.
A lot of historic silences.
Yes.
So one of the things that I found fascinating, in fact, I'm the one that they kept trying to get me to move along because I pressed every button. I looked at. They have a lot of interactive exhibits. You talk about panels, but they're not static. But all of this is for its era, we're talking about now, late 20-teens, modern technology, interactive exhibits, very effectively done.
Yeah, and there were some that were more successful than others, based on the visitor evaluations that I analyzed. Everyone loved the map. Everyone. As long as it was demonstrated properly by the docent, people spent lots and lots of time with the map because, as one docent said, either they want to learn more or they're coming from someplace. They've been to the zoo. They've been to their hotel. They want to see where this neighborhood is in relationship to the other things they know in Columbia, whether they are a resident or whether they are visiting the community. So the map, hands down, most popular, interactive. I think that ability to just move in on the local level, street view, see this wonderful colorized map that Camille Dree did in 1872. Just people were fascinated by it. But yes, they've done film. They have a lot of interactives as well that may not be digital, but let people be hands-on, whether that's dressing up like Tommy Wilson or looking at the world through the stereoscopes and kind of getting a feel for what it would be like to just maybe entertain yourself during Reconstruction.
Well, when the museum reopened, there were mixed reactions from longtime docents, some positive, some negative. It got pretty good reviews in the local press, but they were not all on the positive side.
Yeah, and I think that demonstrates, where we were in that gap between what we as historians know about Reconstruction and what the public understood about it. And the docents got caught up in that as well because, many of the volunteers at that time that Historic Columbia relied on, were retirees. And so they're a product of the same education system, that Albert talked about. They're reading Mary Sims Oliphant in their high school classes or in their 8th grade history class, or something similar if you're from Virginia or from Georgia. And we did have people that were not raised in the state, but were Southerners. And so you're asking them to undo everything they know about the period. And that's a big ask for some people. And it's not just what they're learning in the classrooms. These are stories passed down by family members. We had one docent who began the training sort of proud that he had an ancestor that was a red shirt and that had been passed down in lore in his family. But I think by the end of training, he obviously was having some mixed feelings about the sense of pride he had once had about this family member.
And
that's how deep the story runs. Yeah.
And let's let our listeners remember who the red shirts were. Wade Hampton and the red shirts.
So the red shirts are a paramilitary wing of the Democratic Party, essentially in 1876. And so they are using tactics of intimidation and fraud to essentially turn the election of 1876 to the Democrats and to essentially elect Wade Hampton III as the Redeemer governor and a Democrat to the governorship after, from 1865 to 1876, a period where you have mostly Republican rule. So, and that again speaks to the proximity we've been talking about this whole time. The Hampton family lived in the Hampton-Preston mansion, right? Wade Hampton grew up in that space 2 blocks from Woodrow Wilson as well. So these figures are connected definitely by the geography of the city. But the red shirts ended up, whether it was having mass rallies or showing up with weapons at polling stations or using violence. Essentially, the Democrats win this election through, and this is a great thing that the House can do as well. In one of the last spaces, they have this was not here when I originally did the tour, but they now have a voting box from Reconstruction from one of the neighboring counties. And so in that space where we get to interpret the red shirts, their role, and the return of white Democrats to power, you can actually see an authentic tissue ballot. They had what was called a straight ticket. And so you had to come up and either request the Democratic ticket or the Republican ticket. And so you can imagine red shirts being around you armed. You can see their faces. They know who you are. You know who they are. And so some people may have just picked the Democratic ticket because of that intimidation. Sometimes they're stuffing ballots as well. And what you can see with the Democratic ticket, it reminds me of my youth and credit card the way we used to run credit cards, and you'd have 3 different sheets of paper, right? There'd be like a carbon copy, and there'd be a pink slip, and one was for the customer and one was for the business. It was kind of like that. It would separate. They were thin, and then you were essentially voting numerous times. And so in some counties, I believe Lawrence County, for example, they had more votes than they did people registered for the parties. For both political parties.
Actually, there are not any. Talking about wearing hats, yes, the red shirts were there, but there was a lot of chicanery on the other side, of the Republican side as well.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So, it was not organized in the way that the red shirts were. Stuffing the ballot box, the corruption of the Moses administration was just absolutely incredible. Remember, Franklin Moses bought the Hampton-Preston house, the most corrupt governor in the history of South Carolina.
I was going to say, he was characterized that way in the South Carolina Encyclopedia, wasn't he?
Yes, he was.
Yeah.
Yes, he was.
But I think this also illuminates a challenge of teaching Reconstruction. Absolutely, there's corruption and, people are lining their pockets. And this is an era of where we're, also appointing people to political positions and patronage, right? But it's a national problem as well.
Yes.
And I think that's one of the myths that endures about Reconstruction is that the corruption is just located in the South.
Yes.
And it's a bigger problem within the Republican
Jennifer,
Party.
some earlier historians referred to the Great Barbecue nationally, where everybody had their hand in the till. And I have heard other folks talk about, scalawags supposedly were white South Carolinians who took part, became Republicans and what have you. But there were a lot of economic scalawags because you can go back and find a lot of South Carolina businesses who were not shy about taking government contracts. It's one of
And
those.
there's a lot of rebuilding to do, right? And
Yeah.
that's part of it that's tied to it. I mean, this Columbia, was burned, so there's a lot of rebuilding. And I think this invites an important question about Woodrow Wilson as we think of him as president. How did Reconstruction, and if we think of it as a little r and not the big R, reconstructing after war, how did his experience in Augusta and Columbia frame his understanding of what needed to be done post World War I?
We need to start wrapping up. I'm wondering if we can broaden the conversation a little bit to talk about the transition of this one particular house museum and the others from All Hail Chippendale to something that actually starts to tell the history of a people in an era and not just the house and who lived there.
Well, one of the best examples of transformation in terms of interpretation is Monticello, but that's still Thomas Jefferson.
Right.
But it's interpreting the life of everyone there at Monticello.
Right.
Sally Hemings is mentioned, the whole...
Well, yeah, enslaved people, indentured servants, everybody.
Yes.
And that's Mulberry Row, right? They really worked on, archaeology and preservation of what we would call the slave quarters to tell that story. But what I think makes Monticello different than a lot of house museums like those that Historic Columbia administer, or, you said you were in Denver, maybe you went to the Molly Brown, the Unsinkable Molly Brown Historic House Museum. Monticello has a lot of money and a lot of funding in a way that a lot of these sites don't.
Yes.
So they can invest time, they can invest scholars in telling these stories. And I think it is probably easier for them to do than a lot of places now that are trying to decide what to do with these shrines that don't have the funding for remodeling or rehabilitation or to bring in, scholars that can help them tell a more accurate story about the people in the home.
Well, just listening to you guys talk about what the Woodrow Wilson boyhood home was before and what it has become as a museum of Reconstruction era, it seems like a singular transformation to me, a huge change.
Jennifer, you actually used the phrase bait and switch.
I do.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, I think when you're talking about the 9-year restoration period, Columbia was a different place. This is prior to Dylan Roof and the massacre at Mother Emanuel in Charleston, which I think if you were in Columbia or South Carolina at that time, so deeply affected everyone. When the house opened, the Confederate flag is still at the State House grounds.
Mm-hmm.
So the notion that you could talk about Reconstruction in Columbia where Sherman burned it to the ground. And again, that's a particular narrative, was going to be a hard sell. And I think one of the things that Robin Waits, the longtime executive director who just recently retired, I think her vision was, we're going to look at this as a preservation. That's how we're going to get the support of the city, but we're going to tell this important story. And so whether you agree with a bait and switch style, of transformation, I think that's probably what was necessary, circa 2009, when they're really beginning to look for more support from the city and finish the rehabilitation. So I think it was intentional, but I think also that once we begin to address some of these issues of white supremacy that endure, and one of the things, for example, we know about Dylan Roof is he went to visit plantations before that massacre. He went to sites like historic house museums to sort of take pictures and commemorate this journey he's on in a very disturbing way. I think that's what enabled Historic Columbia to finally rename the home to the Museum of the Reconstruction Era. We had sort of had this moment that we can maybe address the sins of the state authentically and be more honest and not have to sort of hide the way we're trying to tell a more truthful narrative to make it more acceptable or palatable to white Columbians.
Well, you have two wonderful sentences from page 63. I've got here in your book. I've got them underlined. In talking about the name and how things came about, this is from what a docent will say. Today we will explore the teenage years of Woodrow Wilson and his family's experience in the city during Reconstruction. Thus, the Wilson family becomes the lens through which we see this place and time. By the end of the tour, you should have a greater understanding of the complexities of both Reconstruction and Woodrow Wilson. There's no such thing as simple history.
You are right.
As our current governor has often said, South Carolina has a rich and wonderful history, but it's complicated. It's complicated.
And I still contend that, there's a reason why South Carolina is taking the lead on Reconstruction. I think we are the best poised state, other than maybe Mississippi, or some of the places where, you see early Union activity and kind of an early Reconstruction before the end of the war. But I think we are the state best suited to tell this story. And, the more predates the National Park Service site in Beaufort, but between the Port Royal experiment, between Woodrow Wilson and this house, our Reconstruction history is rich, and I think we have an important narrative to tell. I think we can correct the narrative. I think we can make better citizens in South Carolina and think about our complex history and how we got to where we are today. And those are important stories to tell, and South Carolina is the right place to do it.
All right. Well, Jennifer, any last words before we sign off?
No, I'm just so thankful you've had me on today. I'm glad that this house endures, that we are, I still feel like a South Carolinian, even though I'm in Pittsburgh now. And it just makes me very proud that the state has so many wonderful sites, that Historic Columbia has been vital to, shedding some of the misconceptions about Reconstruction and having us think about our very unique history. It's not easy. Sometimes it's messy, and Reconstruction conveys that probably better than any subject in American history. And so I look forward to continuing these conversations, both in house museums, in the classroom. And it's been a joy to share a little bit about this book today with you all and with South Carolina listeners.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation today. I know that I did. The practice of using sites such as the Woodrow Wilson Boyhood Home in Columbia to interpret history for the general public has undergone a lot of changes in the last few decades. And in Rebirth, Jennifer Whitmer Taylor uses the metamorphosis of the Wilson home into the Museum of the Reconstruction Era to offer some of the best practices for interpreting issues of contested public memory, such as white supremacy for 21st century audiences.
Walter Edgar's Journal is a production of South Carolina Public Radio. I'm Alfred Turner, and I produce the show, which is made possible by listener contributions to the ETV Endowment of South Carolina. Remember, the views and opinions expressed on Walter Edgar's Journal are not necessarily those of South Carolina Public Radio or its underwriters.
Many of the books discussed on Walter Edgar's Journal can be found as part of the Walter Edgar's Journal Book Nook section at All Good Books in Columbia, South Carolina, or may be available from your local bookstore. We'll talk again soon.